Good morning, everybody. Today is August 9th, 2020. I hope you are all doing well, staying safe, staying healthy, but also staying spiritually vibrant. Would you please join me this morning for a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, thank you for gathering us on this Lord's Day, this Sunday morning, Lord, to devote our time, our attention, our minds, our hearts to you, to your word, to the teaching and preaching of your word, Lord. Father, I pray that you would illuminate us and just give us your very spirit to be able to understand what it is that you'll be teaching us this morning about your story and the way you work in history, in our lives, in this world. You are a living God and you are working. So thank you, Lord. I pray for my brothers and sisters right now, at home even, that they will be blessed and that they will have some kind of a connection, Lord, to your holy word. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So last week we finished our look at the book of Daniel. And if it taught us anything, I think it was trying to teach us that we need to continue to be faithful in exile. We need to stand firm in our convictions, to stand out from the world, because this is who we are to be and what we are to do. So we finished our look at the book of Daniel, and today we'll be looking at the book of Esther. But we're going to continue this theme of faithful in exile. And the book of Esther is kind of the other side of the coin, if you will. If Daniel says, stay faithful to God, even in exile, I think the book of Esther is trying to tell us God stays faithful to you, even in exile. Right? If Daniel said, stay faithful, you stay faithful to God, even in exile, Esther is saying, God stays faithful to you, even in exile. An interesting fact, God is never mentioned by name or by inference or anything. God is never mentioned throughout the entire book of Esther. Right? It's the only book in the entire Bible that's like this. It's read simply as history, narrative, straight narrative, with no mention of God. But we can clearly see his hand of providence working behind the scenes. God is clearly working. He is clearly doing something. And it's telling us this story of deliverance. It is this story of salvation, really. And so God has a plan. He has a purpose. He's always doing something, even if it's not clear to us at the time. Even if it's not clear to us. You know, I recently watched the Broadway musical Hamilton on Disney Plus. I think about 2 weeks ago. For the first time, I had never watched it. I had kept my knowledge of it to a very minimum, so I wanted to avoid spoilers, and I loved it. And it was great. The hype was real. It is a fantastic musical. But I have to say, when I first started watching it, like I said, I went in blind, totally blind. I was really confused. I hadn't read anything about it, seen any synopsis or anything. And I started watching it straight up, and I was really confused. I was like, what's going on? This is hip-hop in a Broadway show? Or like, why are people of color playing dead white guys, like our founding fathers, people from American history? Why are people of color playing wait, who's that person supposed to be? Who is that person supposed to be? What is happening? And it didn't take me too long to figure it out, but I was really, really confused for at least the first 5-10 minutes or so. And I felt like, man, it would have been super helpful if I had gotten a little bit of context, if I had at least brushed up on my American history just a little bit, and just been reminded of some of these key players and their roles in the founding of our nation. And so I thought it would have been helpful to at least have had an introduction to the Broadway musical Hamilton. And as I started reading the book of Esther, I sort of felt the same way. You kind of go in blind, and God is never mentioned by name, and so you don't really know exactly what he's doing. And so you may be a little bit confused, like, what is this? Is this just history? Is this just a story? And so I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to the book of Esther, and we'll do what I'll call a roll call. I know it's misspelled, but there's a reason for that. We're going to do a roll call and introduce kind of the main characters of this book, get a grasp of the background, the setting, the context, and we'll see that this is really a story about God's faithfulness, even in exile. And so we're just going to do a quick introduction this morning. And so when we last left off last week in Daniel chapter 6, the Babylonian Empire was ended, and we saw the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, right? And I mentioned briefly last week that the scholars and the historians, they aren't 100% sure who Darius the Mede was. And there's a bunch of different interpretations, but history does tell us a lot. And so here's a little bit of the historical background that we do know from secular history and also from the Bible. So we're going to kind of put Darius the Mede off to the side for now. And we do know that Cyrus the Great, he was the first king of Persia, proper. I mean, the historians are very clear on this. Cyrus the Great is the first king of Persia, and he was the one who allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. Ezra chapter 1 starts off like this. In parts of Isaiah, it even says that God says that Cyrus is his anointed, his Mashiach, his chosen one, to do this great thing, this great act of deliverance and restoration for the Jews. Okay, so these are the dates. Cyrus the Great is the first king of Persia. And we know after him came Cambyses the second. This was Cyrus's son. Pretty typical. This was a lineage, a dynasty. And after Cambyses the second, we have Darius the first. And he allowed the Jews to complete the second temple. Okay, so what happened was Cyrus allowed the Jews to go home and return to Jerusalem and start rebuilding the temple, but there were some snags along the way, and so the rebuilding effort was stopped. And so it skipped a couple of kings, and it wasn't until Darius that he was the one that allowed the Jews to complete rebuilding of the temple. Okay. And next we have Xerxes the first. He was the next king after him. I'll talk about the names a little bit, but most secular historians call him Xerxes. And he's famous for his military campaigns against the Greeks. And he's also the king of Persia at the time of the book of Esther. Okay? So this is the time frame of when we are looking at in the book of Esther. It's after a many number of Jews are allowed, they're back home in Jerusalem, and they've rebuilt their temple, and life is getting kind of back to normal in Jerusalem. And yet there are still a significant number of Jews living in exile in Persia. And Xerxes is the king at that point. And then here we have Artaxerxes the first. He was the one that allowed the Jews to reform their state and rebuild the walls. You might remember Nehemiah was the one who kind of spearheaded that effort. And so Artaxerxes was that king. And so the time period we're looking at in the book of Esther comes right in between Ezra 6 and 7, between Darius and Artaxerxes. We're going to be looking at the time period of Xerxes the First. Okay? And so hopefully that's helpful in kind of framing the story of Esther within the larger story of Jewish history. And so again, during the time of Esther, the Jews have already started returning from exile. Right? They've been able to rebuild their temple, but not rebuild their walls yet. Okay? But there are still a significant number of Jews living in Persia. All right. And so let's get back to our roll call and let's actually get into the scripture. And the first character that we're going to meet is King Ahasuerus. Okay. And just for fun, just for kicks, you can go and Google how to pronounce Ahasuerus. Okay. I'm most likely saying it wrong. If you Google it, how to pronounce Ahasuerus, you're going to find a dozen different pastors saying it a dozen different ways. I say Ahasuerus, but in Hebrew it's Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. Okay. And like I said earlier, in Greek they use the name Xerxes. Okay. If you happen to use the NIV Bible, you will see the name Xerxes. All the other translations like the NASB or the ESV, which I use, they retain this Hebrew transliteration, Ahasuerus. Like I said, in Hebrew it's Ahasuerus. Okay, but they are the same person. Okay, we're not talking about two different kings. We're not confused about it. We're simply talking about his name in two different languages. All right. And so let's start in Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And so this is kind of our introduction, not only to the book, but to this king. And we are supposed to be impressed. We're supposed to be impressed. In the days of Ahasuerus, which Ahasuerus? Oh, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. Oh, that Ahasuerus, right? That king, right? His empire was huge at the time, right? Actually, it was thanks to Darius, his father, who had conquered many lands. But Ahasuerus, Xerxes, he inherited this huge kingdom. Right, this huge empire. And verse 2 tells us that he sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. The word is Acropolis. It meant a strongly fortified palace complex. And it sat above, overlooking the city. And that's where his palace was. And it was a huge, massively fortified palace. And so again, we are introduced to this man, this king, and we are to kind of feel it's meant to invoke this splendor, this dignity, this majesty for this king. And we see him throwing this huge banquet, all his officials and his servants, right? However many thousands of those there are. Think about if the president of the United States gave a huge banquet and a parade and a party, and for every single mayor of every city, every governor of every state, every representative of the House, I have a senator. I mean, that's a lot of people, right? And so every single official is invited to come to this party. And I'm guessing that it's not like every single one of them is there at the same time, right? But either way, this is a huge party. And he also says the army of Persia and Media are there too. The entire army, all of the armed forces. Think of our U.S. the Department of Defense, the military branches, right? The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they're all there too. Every single soldier. And some scholars estimate that maybe about 14,000 soldiers are there, along with these legendary 10,000 immortal elite forces, his personal bodyguard. There's 10,000 immortal elites, right? And so, I mean, we're talking it's a huge banquet, this huge party. I mean, even by just conservative estimates, at least 30,000 people are there. Can you imagine like an entire college campus worth of people just drinking and celebrating, and they're just having a good time. And it says that this celebration lasted for 180 days. That's 6 months, right? 6 whole months. And they're just having a good time. They're cutting loose. They're getting ready for the military campaigns they're about to wage. Right? They're about to go, like I said, they're about to go and try to conquer the Greeks. Maybe you've heard of the naval battle of Salamis, or the battle of Thermopylae, made famous by the 300 Spartans, right? And so this is a king who has ambition and conquest in his heart, and he's wealthy, and he has all this power, and he rules over the largest empire the world has ever seen before. And the question for today is, now, what role does King Ahasuerus play in the story of Esther? What is his role? And I think we see that through King Ahasuerus, right, that God kind of uses him, right? And it shows us that God even bends kings to his will, right? God is the King of kings, and God bows to no one. God is impressed by no one. And so not even the most powerful man on earth, with the largest kingdom on earth, is above our God. God is greater, and God bends kings to his will. And so I think King Ahasuerus, you will see in this story, God even uses him to accomplish his purposes. All right, so King Ahasuerus, he's throwing this huge banquet, and he's trying to show off. He is trying to show off, literally, and he showed the riches of his royal glory, right? He's showing off, and he thinks, they've seen my wealth, they know my power. Now let me show off my pleasures that I get to enjoy. And here's an idea. Why don't I bring out my beautiful trophy wife, right? And then they will truly be jealous when they see how beautiful she is. And when they see how beautiful my wife is, my queen is, then they'll really be jealous. Okay, and so the next character we're going to look at is Queen Vashti. Okay, so he says, "Bring Queen Vashti before the king with a royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at." But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And at this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. And so we learn quite a bit about this Queen Vashti here. We learn that she's beautiful, which makes sense. I mean, she has all the time and all the money in the world to spend on her beautification. Think about the skincare or the hair treatments that she has. She's got the most elegant and beautiful clothes in all the world, shoes, all this kind of stuff. And so we know that about her. She's gorgeous. She's beautiful. Lovely to look at. But she's also more than just this pretty face. We also see that she has a strong will. She's willing to stand up for herself, right? Even against her husband. I mean, her husband, King Ahasuerus, he just wants to use her, right, for his own purposes. And she's willing to stand up against that. I will not be used, right? I am my own person. I have my own dignity. I will not be used. And that, of course, makes him very mad. His anger burned within him. And so his officials, and he kind of comes up with this new plan, right? Verse 18. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So the king is furious, obviously. I mean, this is clearly a sign of disrespect, personally. But he's also concerned with how this is going to look, right? The optics. How this is going to look politically. How this is going to impact his kingdom. And he says, and his officials and his counselors also say, this is going to set a very bad precedent. This is going to set a very bad precedent. If even the king cannot control his wife, how are any of the other officials, how are any of the men in the kingdom supposed to be able to control their wife, right? If all their wives start standing up and speaking against their husbands, right, things are going to get chaotic. It's going to be crazy. Right? So the king says, well, yeah, this is bad. So he, in a sense, he has to punish her. I mean, he has no choice, right? And so he comes up with this law, right? Again, one of these laws that cannot be repealed, right? That he's going to strip Queen Vashti of her crown, her status, and he's going to replace her with another who is better than she. Okay, someone who is more worthy of this title, this position of honor. And so, I mean, what happens with Queen Vashti, what happens here is really what sets up the whole story of Esther. And so, what is Queen Vashti's role? I mean, besides the fact that, that she kind of is part of this inciting incident that kicks the whole story into motion. What can Queen Vashti teach us or show us? I think Queen Vashti already hints and already shows us that women can be strong. Women can be strong. Although much is made of Esther's strength and courage, I mean, we tend to overlook Vashti, right? We don't give Vashti enough credit. I mean, she knew, she understood that, women do not solely exist for men's pleasure. She must have sensed that, God created us, male and female, as equals to complement one another, right? My husband does not own me. She knows, she senses. And so Vashti reminds us that women can and should be strong in character. And so we are not surprised when later it is a woman who God uses to save his people. Okay? So that's basically chapter 1 of the book of Esther. We're introduced to King Ahasuerus and Queen Vashti and this inciting incident. Okay. And at the beginning of chapter 2, we meet our next character. His name is Mordecai. And this is what we learn about him. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. And he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And so here we learn a lot about Mordecai. We have his family lineage. He is from the tribe of Benjamin. And verse 6 has this really strange detail. It tells us that he had been carried away from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. And he was part of that first wave of the Babylonian captivity. He was in the first wave of the Babylonian captivity. Now, this is indeed a very strange detail to give. It seems like, okay, what's the point in that? But it's also strange for another reason, because we know from history that Nebuchadnezzar began his exile in about 597 BC. Okay, 597 BC. But the time when these events in the book of Esther are happening, it's about 480 BC, which would make Mordecai over 100 years old. Okay? It's not impossible. It's kind of a strange detail to give. So why tell us that? I think the main point in including this detail is to show us that this is a man who has a connection with the way things used to be. Right? He's deeply rooted in the ancestral home of the Jews. Right? He used to live in Jerusalem. And he's well versed in the laws and the customs of Yahweh, of God. And he has not forgotten this during this time in exile. He was part of the first wave of the exile, and now he's nearing the end of the exile, right? Like I said, some of the Jews have already returned home, and he has not forgotten that. He has not forgotten his God, his customs, God's laws and things. And let's move on. And in verse 7, we are told that he's related to Esther, Hadassah, her Hebrew name. And Esther is the daughter of his uncle. Okay, she is the daughter of Mordecai's uncle. All right, and so that makes them cousins, actually. So Mordecai and Esther are cousins, and he would be one. But still, as cousins, Mordecai, it says that he raises her, took her as his own daughter, right? Which is commendable, which is gracious, right? He brings her in and raises her up, gives her a home. Remember, for orphan children, I mean, she's lost her father, her mother, her home, her livelihood. So he takes care of her, Esther, as his own daughter. And this is commendable, this is gracious, and we are to kind of see him as a very faithful man. faithful to God's law. And so, again, the question is, what role does Mordecai play in the story of Esther? And I think he keeps her grounded. Mordecai keeps her grounded, not just to her ethnic roots as a Jew, right, being from Jerusalem and Judah, but he reminds her of who God is and how he works in the world, right? How God works through the world. So Mordecai, he is kind of the quintessential faithful Jew. He has not forgotten where he comes from, who he belongs to. And indeed, by the end of the story, we are to kind of hold him up as this model of what it looks like to be faithful in exile. Okay. So that's his role. He is kind of the model faithful Jew. Okay. Let's move on to Esther. Okay, we're going to take a look at Esther, Hadassah. Verse 7. And he, Mordecai, was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And so we already know she is an orphan. Her father and mother have died, and she's taken in by her cousin Mordecai. And we also know that she's beautiful, right? She has a beautiful figure, lovely to look at. And her Jewish name is Hadassah. Okay, but she has this Persian name, Esther. And this name, Esther, it literally comes from the Persian word stara, which means star. Esther, I guess it kind of makes sense. Estara, astra, star, right? And it is pretty fitting that the Jewish, the Star of David kind of becomes this symbol of the Jews, linked with, their preservation and things like that. It comes to kind of symbolize and kind of them and their preservation throughout history. Because, obviously we know Esther is the one who literally saves the Jews, preserves them from destruction. And so Esther is God's instrument of salvation. A woman. Shouldn't be too surprising, but it is a woman. God is going to use Esther for his purposes. Let's take a look. Verse 16 of chapter 2. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and he won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And we see that she has been promoted. She's become the new queen. Right? And it says that she won grace and favor in his sight. And it's not just because she was lovely to look at. She had a beautiful figure. It's not just because of that. Right? I mean, we're assuming there were many beautiful women, right? Were taken into the harem. We are to infer that this is God's doing. Really, this is God's doing. And there are quite a few stories that are kind of like this. Right, just like the story of Joseph, right, who won favor in Pharaoh's court, or even Daniel, who we just looked at, who won favor with King Nebuchadnezzar because he was able to interpret his dreams. Right. Esther wins favor with Ahasuerus, and it is not because of her own beauty or her own charm. we are supposed to realize and see and understand that this is God's doing. This is God bringing her up in status because he has a plan for her. He has a purpose for her. He's going to use her in some way, right, to save his people eventually. And so what is Esther's role in this story? Well, obviously the book of Esther, bears her name. And so it's her story, really. But it is to remind us that even the most unlikely of us can be chosen and used for great things, right? Even the most unlikely of us can be chosen and used for great things. Like God places us exactly where he wants us to be. Where has God placed you? And what influence has God given you? Over whom? And for what purpose? What is the purpose for where you are right now? I mean, do you have some measure of influence or authority? Maybe you're a parent. Or you have an immeasurable influence on who your children turn out to be. Are you a boss? Do you have people working under you? Then you have immeasurable influence over your employees, right? And you can use that to show godliness, to show care, to show respect and dignity. Right? Where has God placed you and why? Do you have someone above you, over you? Maybe your child, or a student, or a worker, or an employee, right? Use your position, your place to show your obedience, your faithfulness, to show a Christian work ethic, right? Be dutiful, right? Be honest. Do the right thing. And so wherever you are, wherever God has placed you, right, God can use you to accomplish his purposes. So I think that's what Esther is going to show us. I mean, a Jewish girl, Jewish orphan, becoming a queen, that's not coincidence, right? That is God's doing. And lastly, I want to dip into chapter 3. I know I said chapters 1 and 2, but I just want to dip into chapter 3 because there's a very important character there. But Pastor Michael will walk us through the chapter 3 next week. And every great story needs a villain, and ours is Haman the Agagite. All right. And so Esther has become queen. And at the end of chapter 2, Mordecai has kind of gained favor with the king. He did this thing and he saved his life. And this is how chapter 3 begins. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And so Haman the Agagite has been put in this position of authority. He's kind of second in command, right, to the king, much like Daniel was when we looked at Daniel. So now Haman the Agagite is kind of put into this position. And at first glance, we're just like, okay, so what? Who cares? But Jewish readers would have seen this name, Haman the Agagite, and they would have immediately felt this sense of dread. They would have immediately realized, uh-oh, something bad's gonna happen. In every story, there's always like this dun 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 moment, right? And chapter 3, verse 1 is that moment, right? And the readers would have read that verse, and it would have been like, uh-oh, this is bad. This is bad. And the reason is actually in his lineage. It says that he's Haman the Agagite. And Jewish readers would have known this story that happened centuries earlier, way back in 1 Samuel 15. This is at the beginning of Israel's monarchy, King Saul, right? And God sent the prophet Samuel to give King Saul this message, and it was basically go and strike down the Amalekites. Okay, this group of people, right? They are wicked. You are to destroy them, devote them to destruction. He says. God says to Saul, devote them to destruction. Do not spare a single one of them. You are to wipe them out. Right? Men, women, children, ox, sheep, camel, donkey, everything. I want you to wipe them out, Saul. Okay. And this is what it says in 1 Samuel 15, verse 9. But Saul and the people, Israel, spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. And so it shows Saul was greedy, right? He was supposed to destroy everything, kill everybody, but they spared Agag, King Agag, the king of the Amalekites. They spared him. They wanted to use him as leverage or to gloat over him or kind of rub it in his face or something. And they did not kill the best of the livestock. All that was good, they did not utterly destroy. Right? The best of the livestock, right? The fattest calves, the youngest and the most healthy of the sheep. Right? But all that was despised and worthless. Think of the old sheep or the old cattle or the cows that would not give milk anymore, or the lame and the crippled or the diseased of the livestock. Those ones they destroyed, but they kept the best for themselves. Right? And verse 10, right after this, 10 and 11, it says, and the word of the Lord came to Samuel. And now this is God speaking. I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. All right, and so God regrets making Saul king because Saul just started doing whatever he wanted to. Saul was his own king. He wanted to do his own thing. And so, dun dun dun, again, it is possible that Haman the Agagite was a descendant of King Agag, whom the people spared, whom the people were supposed to kill. Right? And we're going to see next week, because of Saul's disobedience, now, centuries later, the Israelites, God's people, are at risk of being wiped out. Right? How ironic it is that Israel was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites, and now it is a descendant of the Amalekites who will now wipe out the people of Israel, the Jews. So, what is Haman's role in this story, besides being the villain? He is to remind us that disobedience has consequences, even if they're not immediate. Disobedience to God's will, God's command, can have lasting consequences. And sin can fester. It can fester and grow and come back even deadlier than ever. It can come back even deadlier than ever. And so that's our roll call for today. We've introduced the major characters of our story. King Ahasuerus, Queen Vashti, Mordecai, Esther, Haman, and we've kind of set up this plot and the problem, the issue. And so what? What does that have to do with you and me? Well, we are to be reminded that we all have a role to play in the story of God's people. In the great drama of salvation, we all have a part to play. There are an exceptional few that God may choose to use in very dramatic ways to reach non-Christians or evangelize the lost or display God's glory. There are an exceptional few like Esther, and they are the stars of the show, right? They are the stars of the show. And there are some of us, more of us, I would say the majority of us, we are supporting cast. We are just everyday, faithful Christians who show God's goodness through our everyday, faithful actions. People like Mordecai, supporting cast, right? To Esther. He brought her up. He raised her right. Maybe that's one of us. Maybe that's you or me. Maybe our role is to simply be a good Christian parent or a faithful employer, a good worker with a good work ethic. That's the majority of us, I would say. And some of us may even be villains, sinners, right? With lasting consequences like King Saul or Haman. Yet we can be redeemed by the blood of Christ, and we display God's mercy and grace. I don't know who you're going to be. Maybe you will be that exceptional one, a star. Maybe you are just a supporting cast, like I consider myself just a supporting cast. Maybe you're going to be a villain, but God will not give up on you. I don't know, but we do all have a part to play. And here's the main point for today. Here's my main point, brothers and sisters. Do not think that you are insignificant. Do not think that you are insignificant. You are important in God's plan, his story of salvation. Right? He chose to save you if you've accepted Christ and you believe in him and you're trying to be faithful. He's chosen you. You've been picked. You have been picked, handpicked for that role, that part that you are to play in his story. Right? So do not think that you are insignificant. God has a plan and a purpose for your life. He's using you to show the world something about him, something about the way he works in people just like you. Do not think that you are insignificant. You are part of his story, and you have a part to play. So we will continue our story next week. Take care, everybody. Be well, and we'll see you soon, okay? Bye-bye.